To be joined from Boston, Massachusetts by my friend and colleague, Sarah Green Carmichael. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Bobby. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. We're a couple of columns that Clara has Sarah, beg your pardon, has written in recent days, examining the Republican Party's attempt to demonize ESG, DEI, particularly in universities, but also in corporations across the United States. This has been a feature of how the party has operated, and especially some of their frontrunners for the presidential campaign coming up next year, especially Ron DeSantis of Florida. The party apparently thinks that this strategy, it's part of an overall strategy called, I mean, loosely defined as anti-wokeism. The party seems to think that this is a winning strategy, but the numbers are beginning to come in on actual polling. It's not looking that way, Sarah.
No, it's not. The New York Times ran a poll with Siena College in late the last week of July, and they tried a few different sort of head-to-head matchups testing, this war on woke or attacks on woke corporations with other Republican issues. And in every case, the war on woke messaging really fell flat especially when compared to traditional Republican messages like, you know, minimizing crime, pursuing law and order, order at the border, immigration. Those kinds of issues motivated many more of the Republican primary voters that were consulted in the poll. I was particularly struck by there was sort of one surprise in the poll, which maybe hints at some of the thinking behind the politicians who are pursuing this sort of anti-corporation strategy. The voters in the poll seemed really divided between a traditional Republican view of, we should be pursuing low taxes on corporations so that they create jobs, and a more populist message that's sort of newer to come to the Republican Party of we should be imposing tariffs to protect jobs.
Yeah.
That was the only area where I saw anything that sort of surprised me. I was surprised to see how much protectionism now does have support from Republican voters. And I sort of wondered if maybe someone like a Ron DeSantis is thinking, okay, if that's how people feel, I will channel that populism by going after corporations in this other way. But the messaging, fighting ESG and DEI, I'm not even sure a lot of voters know what those sort of acronyms stand for. So it has not worked out for him, to say the least.
For if there are any viewers and listeners who need it spelled out, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And it's not just talk. I mean, someone like Ron DeSantis in his state and Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, in his state, have actually legislation have sort of put their money where their mouth is on this anti-woke agenda. What are some examples of things that they've tried to do, sir?
Yes, those are definitely the two states where we see most of the activity, which makes sense. The governors there are both, men who really want to drive the national conversation, get their names in the news. They figured out this is a way to do it. There have been some other actions in smaller states, but they haven't garnered the attention, and they haven't been part of the kind of a sustained attack that we see in Texas and Florida. So some specific examples would include governors in those states have said that we don't want public universities to have DEI programs. So in May and June of this year, the governors signed laws saying, okay, the public universities in these states just cannot have DEI programs anymore. Really, more recently, Ron DeSantis has been in this fight that he picked with Disney, which is, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but that's another sort of example of this. But he appointed a new board to oversee Disney's kind of special zone in Florida where they have all their parks. And as part of this tit for tat, that the DeSantis appointees just said, okay, well, we're going to ban all DEI activities now, so you can't do that anymore. So in a couple of cases, it's taken that that approach. They've also tried to really ban any taxpayer money from being invested, public pensions, that kind of thing, in funds that would use ESG metrics. Now, there's been a lot of debate over the value of some of those metrics. They're not
Yeah.
all equally valuable, but still, it seems really strange to me that you have Republican governors saying basically, we're going to tell investors what to do. We're going to tell investors what data they can look at and not. That's a real first for the Republican Party, certainly in my lifetime.
Yeah. We'll the defects in both of those areas and how they can be improved in a minute. But you wrote a column a couple of weeks ago before the polling came out, I think, from the New York Times, and you made the point that DeSantis in particular, a tactical or strategic mistake by thinking that companies approach these schemes the same way for the same as universities do. Explain that a little bit.
Yes, sure. So I think in the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling that overturned affirmative action in higher education, you clearly saw Republican activists saying, okay, like we won this big victory. Our next move is going to be going after what they have called affirmative action in corporations. But I would say, the way that DEI programs work in corporations is not really that much like the way that it works in universities at all. In a university setting, you have your applicants, they apply, they fill out applications that are all pretty much the same. It's an application, an essay, some test scores. Everyone's considered at the same time, and the admissions officers pick an entering class, from that pool. Hiring in the corporate world at most companies does not work like that at all. Maybe at some law firms or some consulting firms, you do have sort of what a freshman class in a way. But for the most part, companies are saying, oh, we have an opening here, Janice just quit, we have an opening there. And they're trying to find one person at a time to fill the holes that they have available. And that process just looks very, very different. Some people would include in cover letter, some people wouldn't. Some people might know someone who works there, other people wouldn't. And academics have done a lot of research on kind of what goes into that hiring process, and what they have consistently found is that women and people of color, even white men from lower middle class backgrounds, are consistently penalized unfairly in that process. So most of the DEI programs that these activists are attacking are actually not a thumb on the scale. They are designed to level the playing field so that everyone has a pretty equal shot of competing on a more fair playing field, I would say.
This is not just although there are elements, there's the moral and ethical dimension to these things. They're also really good business practice, as you point out in your more recent column, that basically with DEI, they just managing talent more sort of data driven, and just makes more sense than the sort of more predictable, more certain of success and getting the right kind of talent than just taking a chance that somebody knows somebody and the right person has a cousin who works in accounts and can sort of put their name forward.
100%. An example I like to talk about specifically is the interview process. Most interviews are conducted in a kind of very casual way. It's kind of like, hey, do we get along? Would you fit in here? Are we kind of vibing on either wavelength? But in a company that's really taking DEI seriously, the interviews would be much more structured. The people conducting them would agree ahead of time on what the job criteria were, what questions they would ask to solicit the information that they needed on that criteria. And then they would compare notes afterwards in a very kind of careful, rigorous, structured way. Those sort of structured interviews have been found not only to produce more diverse array of hires, but also to be a better predictor of on-the-job performance. So really, you see, like, performance and diversity goals are going hand in hand there. So that's the kind of example of something where, maybe someone like a Ron DeSantis thinks it makes sense to attack DEI programs, but a lot of the DEI work is like very nuts and bolts stuff of like, are interviews fair? Are the performance reviews fair? Not exactly something that's going to fire up a group of voters in Iowa.
Yeah, and the same thing. Same thing. Companies approach it because it makes good business sense. I mean, our colleague Matt Winkler wrote about this last year, and he pointed out that asset allocation based on G criteria is a $35 trillion industry. That is half again as large as the entire US economy. And to, to deny Florida a piece of that action is just bad business practice.
Yes, totally. And to me, it seems like you're putting a blindfold over investors' eyes. If you're saying, yes, we live in a world where there's going to be heartbreaking wildfires in Hawaii, where there's going to be, we had a tornado rip through Massachusetts not that long ago. That's not normal behavior. But if you're just putting a blindfold over investors' eyes and saying, you can't consider these factors, then actually, I think what you're really doing is you're tying the hand of the free market. ESG practices, whether you're talking about investors or managers, really emerged from a sense that people in business needed a better way to measure some of the negative externalities that were not captured in the balance sheet. It is a totally voluntary movement by managers and investors to try to incorporate long-term risk. That's all that it is. And if you're coming in and saying we're going to ban that, you're really actually tying the hand of the free market in a way that I don't think that someone like a Ronald Reagan would be okay with.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of Vivek Ramaswamy, the other Republican candidates who's projecting himself as the sort of the young, sort of much more in touch with the nation of voters, someone from a tech background, that sort of thing. And he's slamming DEI and ESG, but his company has DEI initiatives itself.
Yes, it does. I mean, that just shows you how mainstream these things are.
Yeah.
It is pretty hard to run a company these days without DEI. It would be very unusual if you were in a company that said, we're actively going to not think about what's happening to the environment. Um, it requires a kind of willful blindness that most managers who want to be in business for the long term are simply not interested in assuming.
And this year, well, most years, with every passing year, more so, this year with the sort of heat waves and really sort of unpredictable, unconventional weather patterns throughout the United States, even in Massachusetts, as you mentioned, but especially in the states where Republicans are strongest, Florida, Texas. You'd think that ordinary Texans and Floridians would not need any convincing that that there are new kinds of risks involved given the environmental change. Whatever your opinions about what is changing, and those risks just is good common business. Presumably, individuals do that in their homes.
Presumably, I mean, it's one of those things that it's a complicated issue in the US more than in other countries. Whenever I edit an article that talks about climate change, for example, I don't get emails from people in Germany or the UK about, oh, climate change is a hoax. But I do get those emails from people in the United States. So in the
Yes.
United States, there is still a faction convinced that climate change is not happening, that even these disasters, that we're seeing are not signs of a changing climate. And even if it is changing, there's probably nothing we can do about it. So there is a kind of, I think, motivated reasoning happening in the U.S. where you would hope that people would kind of see what's happening and be willing to take it seriously. But that is something that that really has not come to a section of the U.S. electorate yet.
Yeah. Now, this and Abbott and Ramaswamy, of course, the part of why they're making anti such a big part of their campaign is that they're trying to distinguish themselves from the 800-pound gorilla in the room. They're trying to make themselves to pull out from the shadows of the big candidate, which is Donald Trump, What are his views on DEI and ESG? I mean, he comes from a corporate background, although not a very conventional corporate background, but still, he has run companies. He still owns corporations, not just in the United States but around the world. Does he have strong views on these things, and have his views evolved at all?
It's interesting because I do think that there was an attempt here by DeSantis in particular to say, I'm going to out-Trump Trump. I'm going to be
Yeah.
even Trumpier on these issues than Trump. But it really has not worked. You don't hear Donald Trump making these issues a key part of his pitch to voters. He has in some ways gone much further. He's not out there talking about the problems of corporate DEI programs. He is out there saying things that are much more overtly racist than that, and overtly sexist than that. And he's, at least this time around, has really made the indictments against him in a way the core of his campaign. So for him, it's really, I think, a cult of personality. Voters are drawn to him because they like his personality, even more than his position on something like immigration. People are not voting for him based on the issues.
No.
So I think DeSantis made a real miscalculation here, thinking, oh, if I, attack DEI and ESG, and also I should add, Abbott and DeSantis have also really made a concerted effort to also attack trans kids and their families as part of this
Yes.
war on woke. They've really done that in an attempt to chip away voters from Trump. But people are not flocking to Trump because of his positions on those issues. They just are drawn to his personality. So it has not worked out for Trump's rivals.
Or is it too early to tell how any of this is playing with the big donors, many of whom have corporate interests. The traditional Republican donor base is very much from corporate America. They're not particularly thrilled with these attacks on EI and ESG because their companies are affected, because their companies are being denied an opportunity to be competitive by following these schemes.
That's an excellent question, and I do not know the answer in terms of how this has affected donations. I know that the DeSantis campaign has burned through a lot of money, and seems to now be having some trouble coming up with more. I know that there are many corporate donors who are wary of another Trump term. So it is interesting to me that you are seeing, I think, a sense of like, where is the money going to go? Because they don't necessarily, a lot of the sort of corporate Republicans don't necessarily have a sort of recipient that they would consider to be the ideal recipient for their donations. At the same time, they don't really want to give it, I don't think, to some Democrats whose positions are, sort of more pro-regulation and pro-worker than maybe they would like. So there remains to be, I think it goes back to the poll I mentioned at the very beginning, where there's now this real split in the party between populism and protectionism and sort of free trade, low taxes. And we're going to have to see how that plays out.
Well, the DeSantis campaign is in complete free fall. The people are leaving or have been asked to leave, and they're going to have to sort of reboot practically. And it'll be interesting to see whether that reboot will include some sort of at least tacit acknowledgement that their strategies have not been working. It's not just a question of personnel, but the messaging by the candidate hasn't been working, and they need to change that messaging.
Yeah.
Have we seen anything in recent days from DeSantis to suggest he's toning anything down?
I don't think so. I mean, I think he's really put all his chips on this approach, and in some ways it makes sense because it used to be for Republicans at the national level that abortion was a great issue for them, that they would have sort of a dedicated base. As long as they said, hey, I'm pro-life, they would have voters who turned out for that. But with the Dobbs decision at the Supreme Court, abortion is now a live issue, and we have seen at the state level, it's a losing issue for Republicans. So I think in some sense, DeSantis thought, okay, I'm going to make this calculation that this war on woke thing is the winning issue, and it's just not. And I think that abortion, Republicans have yet to find that replacement for abortion in terms of driving their base of voters out to vote.
Yeah, you anticipated that it's not just DEI and ESG, it's not just anti-wokeism, even that the sort of traditional messaging isn't quite catching fire in the way that it used for the party. What did we learn from Ohio this month?
I think we learned that a couple things. Voters are smart enough to see when there's like a trick being played on them. They realize that this attempt to change the threshold for a constitutional amendment was really kind of an end run around the abortion issue and trying to change the rules for a vote that they're going to be having soon on abortion. I think they're smart enough to see that. I think we also saw again that there is a majority of Americans who do not want the government regulating the medical care that their doctors can give them and limiting the medical care that they can safely receive. So I think that is something that we have seen play out in other states, Kansas, Kentucky, deeply, deeply red states. And it's, I think, another sort of part of the reason that you have, for example, the corporate level, you've had many corporations say we're going to have to cover out-of-state abortion care because we have employees in these states and we need to be able to offer healthcare equally to all of our employees. And so if someone has to travel for an abortion, we're going to cover that. You saw politicians really try to attack that. And those attacks have also just fallen flat. So I think that kind of dovetails with what we've been talking about in terms of corporations must do what they think is best for their employees and their businesses. And politicians who stand in the way of that are, I think, having a real tough time kind of showing why they should get to tell those executives what to do on those issues. So it's really upended. It's really upended things. You have Democrats saying, you can't regulate these corporations, and then you have Republicans saying, yes, we want to, and that is a complete 180 from where we were 10 years ago.
It's just unbelievable. Next thing, the Republicans are in favor of unions. It really is quite astonishing. But of course, even in the Deep South, companies can, they don't need to use the acronyms in order to follow the business practices behind those acronyms. Those things are now already practically part of corporate culture.
It's true. And actually,
they use the terminology or not, they're just going to, because it's been proven to be good for their business, they'll just continue to do it.
I would hope so, and I think in particular, there's practices that don't fall under DEI that we know have great outcomes for people from marginalized groups. For example, flex time programs have been shown to have a much better impact on employee engagement and retention, and have actually produced a more diverse population of employees than some dedicated DEI programs have. So I'm hoping, my hope is that these conversations and the attacks from the right focus executives' minds on the most effective programs, what really works, and maybe shift some attention away from kind of the obsessing over language that some of these DEI programs can do, or just some of the sort of ineffective trainings that probably most of us have some experience with, that sort of those bias trainings have not been really shown to be terribly effective at actually reducing bias. So the more that we can just put attention on what actually works, I think that the better off we'll all be.
So you early on you talked about, we said that these programs are not 100%. That there are deficiencies and they're constantly being interrogated and sort of adjusted according to needs and in practice. Let's talk a little bit about. Let's talk about DEI first. There's this, as often happens, the acronyms acquire letters of the alphabet. There's talk of DEI-B, with B standing for big. And what are people trying to redress by adding a letter of the alphabet to it?
It's a good question, Bobby. I mean, it used to be diversity, then it was diversity and inclusion, then it was diversity, equity, and inclusion, and now people have tried to add this belonging at the end. I think that the goal is a good one, which is like, hey, inclusion's not enough. We need to have people feel like they truly belong. And that's a good goal, but to me, inclusion and belonging sound very similar to me. And I think you sometimes run the risk of getting an eye roll if you're like, oh, we've added another letter. There's like some new thing for me to learn. And also now is it pronounced Deeb? Like that's not a great, if I'm a branding expert, I'm saying, you don't want a program called Deeb. So I think that there sometimes is a real focus on the language we use, making sure it's
Yeah.
the right language, the most inclusive language. And I think that in some ways, I'm really glad that there's a portion of people who get heated about that and who want to fight that fight. I make a living using language.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think for most people just out there trying to do their jobs, trying to keep up with the ever changing language of diversity, it can feel like a lot. And it can feel like they're constantly, walking on eggshells or putting their foot wrong, or something that was okay to say yet last year is no longer okay to say. And I think that there might be more productive ways to expend the energy, the limited time and energy that we have on ensuring a more fair world for workers.
And with ESG, what are some of the deficiencies there, and what is the sort of latest thinking on how to fix those?
Yeah, I mean, the problem in some ways with ESG, well, there's a couple problems. One, as our colleague Adrian Wooldridge has pointed out, environmental, social, and governance are all pretty different from each other in some ways. Maybe
Yeah.
there's ways to measure those and talk about those things separately rather than grouping them together. So that's kind of one shortcoming. Another is just these things are hard to measure. A lot of companies have, I think, been rightfully accused of greenwashing by making
Yeah.
their metrics look really good. And then you find out, oh, actually, that company is actually polluting a lot, or those carbon offsets aren't really offsetting enough. That approach doesn't even work. So I think the hunt for sort of better metrics that would truly let you know how a company is doing, that has been a long time going. I cannot tell you how many pitches I've gotten over the years from people saying, I have a great ESG dashboard. You should write an article about it.
Yeah.
So I think that is something that hopefully, again, with time and effort will improve. But right now, I think it's still pretty easy to rightfully accuse someone of greenwashing and not actually making their offering more environmentally friendly.
Governance is not sort of opaque, and even in the United States, where there's much more transparency into corporate activity than in most other countries. But governance is really, really hard to just keep track of, never mind measure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. As investors in FTX may remember.
Yeah. You mentioned investors. For investors, these are not just sort of letters of the alphabet. There's there are billions and, or as we said, trillions of dollars behind these that ride on these initiatives. They are designed to protect investments, not just make them better, but just to protect them from the untoward and the unforeseen.
Yes. We live in a world now where there is a lot of risk. I mean, if you had asked someone last year to predict a deadly wildfire in Maui, like, would they have put that on their dance card? Probably not. So I think
Yeah.
that the idea behind both DEI and ESG, I think, is that there is some way in which you are measuring risk in terms of, will this company find itself hurt by an environmental catastrophe? Will your returns be hurt because it will turn out that these sneakers you've invested in are actually made by child labor?
Yeah.
Will you find out that the sippy cup this company makes is full of lead? These sorts of things are aimed to, or, in terms of DEI, will this company be sued for huge sexual harassment settlement? This is supposed to help investors, I think, have a better lens into the type of company that they're investing in so that some of those risks are mitigated. And it does seem to me that's more important now than ever, given the world we live in.
Well, as you point out in your piece, for the GOP, attacks on DE are almost DOA. I'm quoting your piece here, and they need to find another message ASAP. And we will track that very closely. I'm sure corporate America will as well, with a certain amount of trepidation to see who their next target to be. And we'll have other opportunities to talk about it on this program. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thanks to all of the viewers and listeners for joining us as well. You know, we do this practically every day. If you're following us on Twitter or the platform formerly known as Twitter, we at Opinion is our handle, and you can find out our upcoming Riverside or live stream conversations. Please go to bloomberg.com/opinion, read Sarah Green Carmichael's terrific columns on this topic, but also on a wide range of other topics. And you'll find lots of fantastic content there from our colleagues all over the world. Thank you again, and goodbye.